Hello, I'm John Grossman, a volunteer with the Forest History Association of Wisconsin, and I'm happy to welcome you to the second session of our September webinar series. This session titled, The Buildup and the Blowup. Our speaker tonight is Robert Ziel. Robert is a wildland fire behavior analyst residing in Marquette, Michigan. He most recently worked remotely for the Alaska Fire Consortium at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks. This summer, he also worked on the Haystack Fire near Fairbanks, Alaska, the Dixie Fire in central Idaho, and the Greenwood Fire in northeast Minnesota, having only recently returned. Tonight's webinar will pick up from the first one on fire weather and talk about the elements of extreme fire behavior, such as reported by eyewitnesses in the Peshtigo Fire in 1871. As I now hand off to our presenter, be aware of two issues for successful participation. First, note questions you may have for the presenter and take time to pose them via the chat feature at the bottom of your screen, not question and answer. He will respond to them at the end of the session. Two, if you're new to Zoom and you have challenges navigating the system, pose those questions in the same screen and the facilitator will reach out to you personally during the session. Now, along with you, I look forward to this evening's presentation.
Okay, I'm in the process of sharing my screen. Let's see if I can do that. So I'm hoping that you are seeing the introductory slide to my presentation.
Yes.
All right. Well, I'll go ahead and get started then. Thank you. Again, I'm Robert Ziel, recently from the Alaska Fire Science Consortium. I've been a practicing fire analyst for more than 30 years, assigned to fires in at least 20 states in that time. What I can say is that in all those years, I never found myself in a situation as extreme as that reported by Reverend Pernin and others at Peshtigo on October 8th of 1871. They've occurred numerous times in recent history, but as an analyst, I've been fortunate to be on incidents where firefighters have been able to make informed decisions about effective actions. By the time the fire reached Peshtigo that night, there was little to be done but seek safety. I'm not here to talk about the human tragedy. Others much more qualified than I will be making presentations in Peshtigo next month. I'm not even here to talk specifically about the fire behavior at Peshtigo that fateful night. I don't think there's enough information to understand it sufficiently and be authoritative about the physics of what happened. I hope you were able to attend Steve Marion's presentation 2 weeks ago. Please take time to watch his recordings to learn more if you haven't. Suffice it to say, what he found and what he shared helps explain the dramatic events of October 8th. Instead, I hope to share with you examples of fire behavior in my learning and experience that might explain what was encountered. I hope this will help you gain an appreciation of what might have been in their eyes, in their thoughts, and in their hearts when those human perceptions are examined on October 8th. The title I offer here, Buildup and Blowup, may not be precise because these are terms with specific meanings in the fire management circles. But they may be. The buildup was developing with drought over months and over weeks with fires burning across the landscape. The blowup represents the overwhelming fire event that developed over hours the evening of October 8th. But it could represent the conditions and the phenomenon where weather events and conditions already on the ground predisposed a dramatic acceleration in fire behavior. You know, at the same time, the Great Chicago Fire was a conflagration that burned from Sunday, October 8th to early Tuesday, October 10th of 1871. The fire killed up to 300 people, destroyed roughly 3.3 square miles of Chicago, Illinois, and left more than 100,000 residents homeless. The map on the right shows that it was a wildfire with a 5-mile run. The significant difference is that the fuel wasn't trees, shrubs, and grasses. It was lumber configured as buildings. Though Chicago fire was one of the largest US disasters of the 19th century and destroyed much of the city's central business district, Chicago was rebuilt and continued to grow as one of the most populous and economically important American cities. But the very night that that fire broke out, an even deadlier fire annihilated Peshtigo, Wisconsin, and other villages and towns north of the city of Green Bay. In addition to the Peshtigo firestorm, there were similar fires produced by the same weather conditions in Michigan. More than 3,900 square miles were burned in Michigan overall that night, including the area in Menominee County. Not only was the land burned and left barren, thousands of buildings, houses, barns, stores, and mills were destroyed with no lumber left to rebuild. Hundreds of families were left homeless. The extent of property loss, animal deaths, and forest devastation have never been fully determined. Also, like Peshtigo, unknown is the total number of human deaths. Some estimates put the loss at fewer than 500, but they were largely based on families reporting about their missing relatives. But the lesson wasn't learned that night. Wildfires continued to burn in the Lake States in subsequent years. In 1881, Clara Barton, at the age of 60, founded the American Red Cross. The organization's first official disaster relief operation was its response to the Michigan Thumb Fire of 1881. The Red Cross provided money, clothes, and household items to those in need. The Great Hinckley Fire was a major conflagration on September 1st of 1894. It burned an area of at least 200,000 acres, including the town of Hinckley, Minnesota. The official death count was 418, though the actual number of fatalities was again likely higher. In October 1908, a large forest fire consumed a large portion of Presque Isle County in northeast Michigan, and most of the area of Metz within it. Killed were 26 men, women, and children, many of whom were on a train derailed as superheated rails were not able to support and direct the movement of the train. Look at how the rails deformed as they derailed the passing train. The Cloquet Fire was a massive fire in northern Minnesota in October of 1918, caused by dry conditions and sparks on the local railroads. The fire left much of western Carleton County devastated, mostly affecting Moose Lake, Cloquet, and Kettle River. It was the worst natural disaster in Minnesota history in terms of the number of lives lost in a single day. In total, 453 lives were lost in this fire, and 52,000 people were injured or displaced. 38 communities were destroyed, 250,000 acres were burned, and $73 million in 1918 dollars property was damaged. $13 million in federal aid was dispersed as a result. Well, I'm going to change gears and show you a graph of fire history. It's really quite surprising. So this is a graph of area burned for the United States. It shows the area burned by year, but it only begins in the mid-1920s because statistics weren't available before then. But you'll notice that how many more acres were burned in the early years of our history that are burned even today, with a commitment to suppression that began to grow in the 1930s. You can see the line falling from the 30s to the late 50s and staying relatively low since, although you do see an increase in the recent years with all the fire activity you're seeing on the news. The 50 million acres burned in 1930 is more than the land area of Wisconsin as a whole. This shows the impact of these destructive wildfires a century or more ago. We are observing a resurgence of wildfires overwhelming communities in the same manner, with names like Paradise and Greenville in California, Fort McMurray in Alberta, Canada, and Gatlinburg, Tennessee. Just a few names that have crossed our consciousness in the last few years because of the homes lost and the lives lost. This serves as an introduction to the problem. From here, my presentation is meant to give you some perspective about wildland fire behavior so you can appreciate what folks were facing when you learn their stories later in the events to come. I plan to offer examples of the several factors that add up to the fire phenomenon. The fire environment includes the conditions that support or can resist wildfires. I'll talk about how wildfires start and spread. And I will try to show you what some of the observations of fire behavior from that night might have looked like and felt like. The fire environment is the specific combination of factors that influence the potential for wildfires on any given day in any given place. Traditionally taught as a fire triangle, the most important factors can be grouped as fuel conditions, weather influences, and topography or terrain factors. You can see here that the fuel conditions define what the fuels are made up of, how they are arranged, and how flammable they are. The weather influences are the typical things we talk about. How hot is it? How dry is it? And how windy is it? Finally, topography is not a huge factor in the upper Midwest, but let's include the lake influence here, since Lake Michigan and its bays in the area are so large. Water bodies such as these can create onshore and offshore breezes that can reinforce or change prevailing wind directions. Well, let's start with fuels. On the left is a map of the early vegetation of Wisconsin, while the map at the right shows the area burned during what is now known as the Peshtigo firestorm. I've outlined that area on the early vegetation map on the left. Though there is some pine, the orange colors, and pine barrens, the stippled yellow colors up in the upper left-hand corner of that box, in or near the burned area, much of it was called Northern Mesic Forest in green, with some conifer swamps in olive. Now, mesic forests are not typically associated with firestorms, but in the late fall, especially dry ones, leaves fall from hardwood trees and provide very available fuel. There were pines and hemlocks mixed in as well, so this map might not give the full picture. Also, with new construction demanding Lake States lumber for Northwood's logging operations and sawmills, the fuel condition was not typical for a mesic hardwood forest. As an example, enough pine was harvested from the Black River Valley alone to build a boardwalk 9 feet wide and 4 inches thick around the entire world. I got that from the Wisconsin Historical Society. This fuel condition was found widely in the Lake States and was concentrated close to mill communities like Peshtigo making them especially vulnerable. Loggers and settlers were burning in various locations to clear lands and open access for settlement. Much of what was producing smoke over the weeks before that fateful day of October 8th was coming from the burning of fuels like this. One final point about fuels. There are national programs, FireWise and community wildfire protection plans, developed to encourage property owners to protect their homes from wildfires and their neighbors from fires in their backyards. Just imagine what the ground surrounding settlements might have looked like back in 1871. I encourage you to take a look at your home and the lands that surround it to make sure that your wildfire hazard is reduced. You can get help with it if you need by talking to your local DNR or Forest Service office. This graphic highlights things you can do to protect your home. Are you prepared? The second fire environment factor I mentioned was weather. Weather influences the burnability of the fuels we were just talking about. One way we look at it is to interpret how weather influences fuel moisture and flammability. When dry days pile up together over several weeks, fuels get drier and drier, and the fires burn hotter and hotter. In this graph, the buildup index for 2021 in black, that's this year, is compared to historic trends in cumulative drying through a fire season. So the maximum daily trend is in red, the average is in blue, and the minimum is in green. This one is for Washakie near Peshtigo. Notice the elevated BUIs in June. You can see those in the graph. The black line is actually coming up to and touching the red line. Followed by more average conditions. You can see it jumping back and forth around the blue line there in July. More rain kept things in check in July. It's a similar graph, but it's unique because it uses the drought code. It's perhaps a little more self-explanatory, but like the last one, the 2021 season is in black. It's compared to the historic trends, red for daily maximums, blue for the historic trend, and green for the daily minimum trend. Again, if you look there in June, you see the black line coming up to and tracing alongside the historic maximums of the day. And once you get into July, you see that it falls back and traces more along the average line. When periods of dry weather extend into months, more of the landscape wants to burn. Green vegetation becomes flammable, and fuels in the dirt, called duff, begin to burn like charcoal. The more that can burn as drought develops, the greater potential for large fires. In the case of the Peshtigo fire, the fuels were land clearing debris, logging debris, and potentially flammable pines, firs, and spruces. And with larger fires, come greater impacts to people and their communities. Steve Marion discussed the summer and fall drought in 1871, leading up to October 8th. As you can see here, all three reporting locations, Chicago, Fort Embarrass, and Sturgeon Bay, reported building droughts in the late summer and fall of 1871. You will see that I highlight several quotes from eyewitness accounts through the presentation from here on. I hope to associate an explanation of the phenomenon that they're talking about. The first, almost with the first steps taken in the street, the wind overturned and dragged me with the wagon close to the tavern. These words from Reverend Peter Pernin highlight the importance of wind to wildfires. Wind, once fuels are dry enough, is the most important factor for the speed with which fires move and the size they grow to. The winds must have been especially strong that night if it could push over and move a wagon. These scenarios where cold fronts approach and pass specific locations like Peshtigo produce strong winds that change direction as they approach, reach, and pass given locations. I placed arrows that show the wind direction ahead of from the southeast as they approach from the southwest and after the front passes from the northwest or even to the north. Think about it. That's a 180-degree switch in wind direction as that front moved through that fateful night. As we try to visualize what the citizens of Peshtigo encountered that evening, it might help to understand how wildfires burn. Generally, they start from a point, the ignition point in this image. You see it in the lower third of the image. With the wind direction, the head of the fire towards the top burns most intensely and spreads most quickly. The backing fire against the wind towards the bottom spreads most slowly, producing much less intensity as it burns. On the sides, the flanks they're called, of the fire, they spread laterally, somewhat intermediate between the head and backing fire intensity. But it's not only where on the perimeter of the fire you look, but also what is burning at that location. There was probably a lot of ground fire that fall of 1871 based on the drought conditions they experienced. You can see on the left, the ground fire is actually burning in the ground, not above it. Surface fires are common, and there's wide variation in how intensely the surface fire burns. Often, surface fires initiate crown fires that burn through the canopy fuels. These fires produce a lot of heat and make fires difficult to control. You can see here a simple, modest surface fire burning in the shade of forest tree canopies. The flames are much less than a foot in height, burning only the top layer of leaves. This is also a surface fire, but maybe more akin to what was burning in Northeast Wisconsin that fall in 1871. When trees were harvested for lumber products, much of the tree was left where it fell. This happened over many years, and 1871 wasn't the first. These dead fuels became drier and drier and were most flammable during drought periods like the summer and fall of 1871. That flame there is much taller than the full-grown person in the foreground. This is a prescribed burn to reduce slash after a harvest to prepare for tree planting. Just to give you some perspective, when slash burns, there is so much fuel that it often can't burn fast enough, and unburned particles and combustion gases are lifted into the sky, filling a dark smoke column. Another quote, "On looking toward the west, whence the wind had persistently blown for hours past, I perceived above the dense cloud of smoke a vivid red reflection of immense extent." The folks living in Peshtigo and surrounding areas had been living with fire for weeks, but what they knew from that experience probably didn't prepare them for what was to come on October 8th. The ominous oranges and purples in this image suggest that fire may be bursting through at any time. Just imagine what this scene might look like after dark. I saw nothing but flames, houses, trees, and the air itself were on fire. You can just imagine when all you can see is what's on fire is a pretty distorting sort of vision not knowing where to go, what's safe, and how to get there. The terrible whirlwind that had burst over us at the moment I was leaving home had, with its continually revolving circle of opposing winds, cleared the atmosphere. These vortices, no one in Peshtigo could distinguish the main fire from the tornado. These vortices, mentioned by several reports in and around Peshtigo, the fire itself and other fires in the area, can be disorienting. They can directly threaten you with heat, embers, and projectiles, and they can block your escape. As the storm closed in for its touchdown on a superheated landscape, few people survive and experience within a crown fire or a blow-up situation. Here you will notice first the boles of the trees beginning to smoke as the volatile chemicals in the wood pyrolyze as they approach the ignition point. You will notice spotting onto the surface ahead of the main fire's arrival. And you will notice when the fire arrives, there is nothing but fire filling every space in the view screen. I'll just pause and let this play out on your screens. It was that of a cloud of sparks. Out of the I did forget part of the way. So another quote, out in the sugar bush, John McGregor could not see south of him either. He only felt the gust and saw the sudden shower of sparks flying onto his house. A fire like that produces embers, a lot of them. When devastating fires approach and pass through communities, they lead with the ember showers. This video depicts what an ember shower might produce and how it might look showering a home or other buildings. On Saturday, October 6th, Samuel Drew, the lighthouse keeper, kept the Green Island Lighthouse lit even in the daylight, but the fourth order lens could not cut through the smoke. This casual phenomenon addendum to the Fort Embarrass weather record states on October 1st, heavy fires in the woods to the southeast and the southwest and burning furiously, destroying everything before it. The Peshtigo firestorm didn't start on October 8th. I will show you additional records highlighting that the landscape had been burning for weeks in the area around Peshtigo. An important part of the story. Remember my title, Buildup and Blowup. When you have lots of fire on the ground and weather conditions significantly enhance the burning conditions, it's possible to develop something called mass fire ignition. In other words, when enough different points are burning with enough intensity to influence the other points of fire around them, they reinforce each other's intensity, and you can develop super convection. As the hot air rises above the burning fire, it draws air from around it. This creates wind, and that wind can and does affect adjacent fires. Imagine all the fires burning and each one contributing to the convection and the wind that is generated. A real blow-up situation. I'll bet this is a rare sight for most of you. Perhaps you've never seen a smoke column like this, even on TV. But this is the result of extreme convection over a fire that results in what is called a pyrocumulus cloud. And in this case, even a lenticular cloud above it, showing strong winds aloft. If you have a blow-up situation, which may have occurred at Peshtigo, the smoke columns can be impressive. This sound resembled the confused noise of a number of cars and locomotives approaching a railroad station. This picture from the Mac Lake Fire from 1980 in Michigan's Lower Peninsula, the fire itself killed a firefighter that was operating a tractor plow. If you look closely at the bottom of the image in the center, you will see a tractor plow escaping the fire. There's no doubt the operator heard the locomotive chug mentioned in the quote. Believe me, it isn't a subtle roar. The air was no longer fit to breathe, full as it was of sand, dust, ashes, cinders, sparks, smoke, and fire. The last two images showed impressive smoke production. Smoke can be amongst the most insidious hazards associated with fire. As mentioned in the vortices slide earlier, smoke can be disorienting. It can compromise your thinking the longer you're breathing in thick smoke because of the carbon monoxide concentration. Eventually, it can disable you, and after enough exposure, at high enough concentrations, even kill you. Again, folks in and around Peshtigo were living with fire for weeks. This casual phenomenon report that accompanied the September weather record at Fort Embers mentions dense smoke from as early as September 13th, 25 days before folks went into the river at Peshtigo. The report was repeated on the 14th. Of note here also is the report of frost, both light frost through much of the first half of the month and the killing frost reported on September 20th, turning green vegetation into dead brown fuels that increased fuel loads dramatically by October 8th. By early October, the air folks were breathing was filled with dense smoke. Take a look at the temperature readings in the four left columns. Early in the month, temperatures nearly reached 80 degrees. And by 9 p.m. on October 8th, the temperature recorded at Fort Embers was still 70 degrees after being warm all day. These conditions, accompanied by drought and fire on the ground, continued to pump smoke into the atmosphere day after day. This picture from Fairbanks, Alaska, in the summer of 2004, hopefully gives you a little perspective about the fire environment that fall. Stop for a minute and count your breaths. Now multiply that number across days and weeks back into September. When fires persist due to drought, the smoke they emit is especially harmful, with incomplete burning products of complex chemicals and carrying small particles that damage lungs. The last point about smoke, the last images of smoky Fairbanks was no closer than 10 miles to the fire. Smoke moves long distances and gets pooled and stopped wherever air movement is blocked. This map from August of this year shows the spread of smoke from fires on the West Coast and one from Northeast Minnesota and others from Canada. Obviously, the closer you are to fires, the heavier and more dangerous the smoke. In closing, I'm not sure what there is to say about the tragedies that make up a part of our own memories and our own histories. Peshtigo is known to many firefighters for the fatalities, for the accounts, for the river that forced choices, and for the time of year that seems so benign to most of us today. I hope I've given you some perspective about what the fire they experienced looked like, sounded like, and felt like. And I hope that you take time to join Stephen Pine's presentation in a couple of weeks, as well as view the recording of Steve Marion's presentation on the weather if you haven't seen that. Our 3 webinars are meant to set the stage for the events in Peshtigo early next month. I hope to see you there. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent presentation. And just a reminder, if you have questions, go ahead and enter them into the chat feature, and either Tom or I will refer them back to Zeke. So see a couple questions in Q&A. Nothing there. And good job, Zeke. Actually, excellent presentation. Really excellent presentation. I have a question about the cost. I know you work with current firefighting situations. How is the cost shared with landowners?
So in today's efforts, actually, most costs for large wildfires are borne by the Forest Service. There are cost sharing agreements, but all of the resources brought in from the outside are funded by Forest Service suppression funds. It is clear that when private individuals are determined to be responsible for a fire, they can be held liable for those costs. But for the most part, the residents are not expected, private landowners especially, are not expected to bear or share in the cost of fire suppression efforts.
Okay. Do you have an idea, the Minnesota fire, for example, burned for a couple of weeks? What was the cost about on that fire?
So the Greenwood fire, the largest of them, burned 27,000 acres, started on August 15th, and there are still individuals assigned to that fire. When I left, the cost for that fire had risen to above $15 million.
Wow.
And that's a relatively small fire. They used something called very large air tankers early in the process to try and stop the fire. Basically, large jets with a retardant on board. They tried to cut the fire off at a couple of different locations. There were several helicopters assigned while I was there. There were actually loggers requested, their equipment was requested, and they were used to clear and improve fire breaks to perhaps burn off, as well as firefighters that were assigned to the fire, its hand crews, engine crews, and the like. So it is not a small task to stop fires, especially under drought conditions like they were experiencing this summer.
Another question is, how unusual is it to have extreme fire weather in the fall? I usually think of the fire season being a spring phenomenon.
Well, it is unusual. I think most of us would think of October as not the time in northern Wisconsin or the Upper Peninsula of Michigan or the Arrowhead of Minnesota. It's not the time that we have fires. But when you have a situation like they had in 1871, those warm temperatures in October, the leaves had fallen, all of that activity fuel was there, and they were under this drought scenario that if you get fires started and they had plenty of fire on the ground, they can be very hard to stop when the winds start blowing.
Okay. Another question has to do with the Peshtigo fire. It says, in terms of the fatalities, over what period of time do researchers consider a death related to injuries suffered from a great fire like Peshtigo? I ask because a number of the graves in the cemetery at Peshtigo are from years following the fire.
I'm not sure I'm an authoritative respond to that question. I think that'd be a great question for folks there in Peshtigo. I do think that it probably does become a more tenuous connection the longer someone survives after injuries from something like a wildfire or an auto accident. I think that it certainly was a low number reported there, if not because of the number of people that survived for extended periods, but for all the people that they didn't even know were there.
Okay. And another question asked about, could not controlled fires been burned in advance around the Peshtigo, the perimeter of Peshtigo?
I think I did state somewhere in the presentation that by the time they got to October 8th, all they really could do was look for safety. Sometimes we call them burnout operations, that if we see a fire approaching values that we may try to create a burnout to sort of stop the fire. The main fire sometimes pulls that burnout into it and actually stops the fire. And there was a lot of fire on the ground at that time, probably predisposing what happened. But without control of those fires, it's almost impossible for them to be useful or effective. They would have really had to have had more of a plan than you would figure a group of people, at that time in 1871 could have amassed.
Then this is more a comment. Fantastic presentation, enhances my understanding of the Peshtigo fire. Personally experiencing the Oakland Hills firestorm in October 1991, it's a little easier to imagine the experience of Peshtigo citizens. And I think that's the last question or comment I have in the chat or the Q&A feature. So,
well, I'd just like to respond to that last comment. That was my hope this evening, is to not actually try and paint the picture of the Peshtigo fire for you, but to give you other examples that might illustrate and help you visualize the Peshtigo fire. And that person's comments about the Oakland fire reinforced my point. So thank you.
And with that, I think I will turn this over to John for a few closing comments.
Reinforce the superlatives that others have offered. Great job, Zeke. We truly enjoyed it. We hope all of you enjoyed this evening's presentation. Please be aware that tomorrow you'll receive an email inviting you to complete a survey on your webinar experience. Please take time to complete and return it. Your advice is critically important to us in our efforts to serve you. We believe that all of life really is connected over the miles and years. Your advice establishes that connection between us and is the basis for our growth and improvement over time. And finally, make note that this one webinar connects with the next one on the Peshtigo paradigm which deals with how learning from this national tragedy began to influence changes in human behavior in the late 1800s and continues to offer opportunities for learning in the modern day. Thank you again for your participation. We look forward to seeing you next time.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it.